This was a slideshow that I assembled for school. I wanted to record it because I ended up being happy with the finished product. So this here's the wedding at Cana. It's the biggest painting in the Louvre. It measures in at about 6 by 9 meters. Pretty massive. There's some tourists for scale, and I don't think anybody would be amiss in calling it art. It's a masterpiece in color and composition and all the fine details worked in. It's a big piece of work. Of course, comics might not be considered art by many. For one thing, they're certainly not as large as the wedding at Cana. They can mostly fit in the palm of your hand, and they're usually littered with ads, but they still take a lot of work. And a lot of people might find that hard to believe, and I think that part of that comes from how a lot of people don't quite know how comics are made. The image of the painter at his easel in pop culture canon isn't quite as strong as, say, the cartoonist at the drawing board. And it doesn't help that comic books are scaled reproductions of a work versus a painting, which is the original canvas the painter painted on. And there are a lot of comics that I think could very easily be used as examples of comics as art, the kind of stuff that your English teacher would probably like. But the thing is, a lot of these comics are made by small teams of just 1 or 2 people. And when you get to teams that are so specialized and comics which are so unique, they become worthless examples. It's kind of hard to use these as examples for how the entire art form is made. So to do that, I think you need a base case. You need a comic so elementary, so simple, so uncomplicated, so lowbrow that you could accurately use it to represent the entire medium. Archie comics are mostly comics about teen hijinks for children. It's the kind of thing that you read as a kid when you're, just about to go into high school and you're imagining how cool it would be. And then, you get to high school and you realize it's not usually that fun. I want to use an Archie comic as an example. This one here, I'm not going to read it all out because I think that would take a lot of time, but just notice how much work has to go into a relatively short comic. It's not quite 6.5 by 9 meters, but I think this is about 40-something panels. And you'll have to remember as I go, I'm gonna just break down one panel, but remember as I go through that any work I describe has to be repeated, times 42 to make a comic. And of course, superhero comics can be much longer. They're usually like 22 pages. So let's zoom in on this panel here. So this is the finished product. Again, just keep it in your head because this is what we're going to be working up to throughout the presentation. So the next slide might be a bit of an abrupt change. Never mind. Gosh, it's been so long I don't even remember the order of my slides. There are 4 basic steps for making comics: writing, penciling, inking, and coloring. Writing, because any comic starts with a story. There's usually, if you have a writer, there are really 2 ways to write a comic. There's scripting, and that's sort of what it sounds like. It's a movie script. For comics, each panel will be described, each page, each dialogue balloon. So the panel above, the script might say, might have all the lines for the characters. It might describe, the basic background. Maybe it'll describe even some emotion in some of the characters and how they're standing. Plot outline, at least in comics, is usually a pretty short thing. Marvel Comics was famous for its outlines, and this strip was actually drawn by Dan DeCarlo, who used to work at Marvel. Though Archie comics, as far as I can tell, were scripted, but a plot outline would be like a 2 or 3 sentence synopsis by your editor or writer, what have you, With that, the artist would draw the whole comic, and then your writer would come back and basically add all the dialogue. Next is penciling. And again, I hope you held that previous panel in your mind when you're seeing this. But this is how really any drawing starts. It's kind of a loose pencil sketch. They do these on big sheets of Bristol board, 11 by 17 inches. Again, not quite wedding at Cana height, but you can see the basics starting to take shape here. Maybe you can even see which character is which, but this is the kind of thing you show to your editor, and maybe they ask you to make some changes. But this one seems to be okay with this hypothetical editor. This is when they add lettering and when you tighten up your pencils. Now, lettering, you may always have wondered how letters in comics are so straight. There's a tool called the Ames Guide, which helps you measure up parallel lines in which to write letters. And you can see now things are starting to tape shape, blah. You can see which characters are which. You can see little spots of black are being filled in. This is the kind of work that you turn over to an inker. Before we can get into inking, though, I just want to mention composition. I myself don't know much about composition, so this is all very essential, very basic. But you can see that you read left to right, so essentially you're following the character's gazes. It kind of makes you an active participant in the scene as you follow the gazes from left to right to what the characters are looking at. And there's a little bit of space between the group on the left and Jughead on the right, which I think aids in that effect. And of course he is separated from his friends not just by distance but also by the door frame. He's standing, of course, inside and they're outside. The lettering helps with this too, of course, going from left to right. If for some reason Jughead's word balloon was all the way on the left side, it would not flow quite so well. Inking is the process of tracing over the penciled artwork to make it more high contrast for reproduction. Of course, I'm underselling it by calling it tracing. It's really much more than that. The inker has a lot of control over the penciler's final art. There's a lot you can do with inking because there are lots of different inking styles. So here's like 3 examples of what the inks over the Archie Comics pencils could look like. You could see the most drastic departure in style at the bottom there, a very detailed, heavy style. This is just sort of a basic example because I'm not much of an inker and I have to draw all of these. Of course, for a simple comic like Archie, you're probably going to go for the sort of simple ink. And you can see there are some black spots filled in. Those are important. You use those to help kind of draw the eye a little bit. Ow, I just hit both my elbows on my desk. I don't even know how you do that. But no, the bits of black can help to draw the eye to certain parts of the image, or and it's very good for shading, because comics are printed so small, it helps to just be able to block stuff out, like the shadow under Moose's chin or behind the bush on the right. If you render that shadow out and then shrink it down for printing, it might not reproduce well, all that small hatching at that size. Next comes color. So the way coloring works is you would paint over a sized down reproduction of the finished inked comic book art with a set of dyes. I believe this industry standard was Dr. Martin's dyes. You can see there's all those scribbled in notes in the margins of the page on that image on the left. That's a coloring guide, and all those scribbles are for a color separator. It's basically telling them at what well, here on the right, sorry, I'm so awful at explaining this blog. On the right there, you can see someone cutting out a plastic sheet over a finished work of art. That is a ruby length sheet, and for comics, that is how colors are applied. There are 3 colors: cyan, yellow, magenta, and they come in a few varying opacities. I believe it's 25% opacity, 50% opacity, and 100% opacity, and you can layer those on top of each other to essentially make any color. Well, not at any color, obviously, there's some limits, but you can make a lot of colors. And so you can see all those notes around the margins are basically saying at what opacity to layer those sheets. Of course, that's why the colors here are maybe a little awkward looking, because it's not the finished product. It's just there to help the color separator determine what's what. And just like an inker, coloring isn't a job you should look down upon, because it gives you a lot of control over the atmosphere and the mood, or the time of day of the scene, or just, how something feels. It's an important job. But of course, for Archie comics, because these are, again, mostly for kids, you're going to get something nice and simple and bold like this, and maybe a little bit non-literal too. And there's your finished product. There's your final Archie comic. Now you know how the sausage is made, and perhaps this hasn't convinced you that comics are art, but next time you pass through a grocery store checkout aisle, you can look at an Archie comic and at least appreciate the work that went into it.